Good afternoon, honorable members of parliament, our distinguished resource persons. Good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Teddy Bagilat Jr. I'm a former member of parliament from the Philippines, and currently I am the interim executive director of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. And in behalf of APHR, the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, or IPP4B, and the Stephanos Alliance International, I would like to warmly welcome you to the webinar on the corona crisis and its impact on human rights and FoRB in Southeast Asia. As part of the series of webinars of the Southeast Asian Conference on Freedom of Religion or Belief, or the CFORB conference in 2020. First of all, please allow me to introduce the co-organizers and their work on freedom of religion or belief in our region. First, we have the APHR, which is a regional network of current and former parliamentarians who use their unique mandates to advance human rights, democracy, justice, and equitable development in Southeast Asia. Then we have IPP4B, which is likewise a network of parliamentarians and legislators from around the world committed to combating religious persecution and advancing freedom of religion or belief. And for our third co-organizer, we have Stephanos Alliance International, which is a religious freedom and human rights organization with historical roots in Christian mission work, dedicated to defending freedom of belief and religion as expressed in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since 2019, APHR and IPP4B have partnered to implement a joint project which seeks to enhance the roles of parliamentarians in safeguarding freedom of religion or belief within their parliamentary functions. Under the framework of this project, we have established the Southeast Asian Parliamentarians on Freedom of Religion or Belief, or the CFORB, as a working group of parliamentarians and politicians in Southeast Asia working to advance FoRB in the region. So CFORB, of which many of your members, has undertaken fact-finding missions in Indonesia and Malaysia, has implemented policy dialogues related to mitigating religious tensions, tackling hate speech, and legislating religious freedom, and has also conducted a number of regional trainings and forum on FoRB and human rights. On the other hand, over the past years, APHR, IPP4B, and Stephanos Alliance have supported CFORB conference and its network. So CFORB, which is different from CFORB, the CFORB is a network, on the other hand, or an assembly of religious freedom advocates, so composed of parliamentarians, civil society organizations, and individuals who are dedicated to promote freedom of religion and belief in Southeast Asia. The CFORB network is an ongoing project to advance FoRB, bringing religious equality and liberty for all individuals in Southeast Asia. The series of webinars marks the 6th CFORB conference since it was first held in 2015 in Bangkok, Thailand. Now let's proceed to the webinar proper. With the spread of the coronavirus earlier this year, governments around the world were forced to impose far-reaching and invasive. I'm working at home, so sorry for the dogs, the noise of the dogs. So as I've said, governments around the world were forced to impose far-reaching and invasive measures on their populations, including declaring a state of emergency. While restrictions on fundamental freedoms were accepted in well-established democracies, and likewise in totalitarian regimes, the latter were more prone to impose illegitimate restrictions and extend their powers beyond the immediate period of emergency response. Further, since the start of the outbreak, social media platforms have been used to spread fear and, in some cases, hateful, xenophobic, and discriminatory comments. And this afternoon, we are fortunate to have excellent speakers in the field, which will examine the following questions. First, how fundamental freedoms might have been illegitimately restricted in Southeast Asia amidst COVID-19. How these restrictions have affected religious communities and the right to freedom of religion or belief. How has hate speech proliferated in Southeast Asia during the COVID-19 pandemic? What are the measures and guidelines that could be introduced to parliamentarians, government officials, and other stakeholders to ensure that the implementation of emergency powers and measures are conducive to the protection of human rights? And finally, we hope to answer also what are the guidelines to address and counter COVID-19 related hate speech. But before we proceed, as usual, we have some key housekeeping arrangements. First, the webinar, I'd like to inform you that the webinar is live stream on the IPP FoRB Facebook page. And if there are issues with publicity, if you'd like to remain incognito or anonymous, you have full control to turn off your video or keep your identity anonymous. Second, if you are not speaking, it's proper protocol to remain muted throughout the webinar. And third, everyone is welcome to ask questions during the Q&A session. You can either write your question on the chat box or raise your hand. For those of you who are familiar with the Zoom app, by raising your hand, it means going to the participations bottom at the lower panel of your Zoom application. Click it, click the participants button, and the feature will appear underneath the list of participants, the feature on raising your hand. So once invited to ask the question, please unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself once again if you are done. So now let's proceed to the presentations. Our first speaker, and by the way, we have 4 speakers who will be given 10 minutes, but being a liberal, member of the Liberal Party, I will be quite liberal with the time. But they have already been briefed that they can keep their presentations to within 10 minutes. And our first speaker is a researcher with Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation, Mr. Joseph Benedict, who is a global civil society. Civicus, is a global civil society alliance. On the other hand, Mr. Joseph Benedict has covered Asia Pacific region as the Civicus Monitor, which is an online tool to track civic space globally, and he is also based in Malaysia. He has worked for over 2 decades on human rights issues in the region. And Joseph will be covering in his sharing the regional overview on how COVID-19 has impacted on human rights and fundamental freedoms in Southeast Asia. He will also talk about how governments in Southeast Asia have handled the COVID-19 situation, and has SEA governments or the ASEAN taken advantage of extended powers, for instance, the draft penal code in Indonesia and the emergency decree and mobile app in Thailand. So, Mr. Joseph Benedict, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Teddy. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. So yeah, I'll try to my very best to keep it to 10 minutes. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I have sent to the organizers. I hope you can see it now. All right. So I'll start. So good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. And once again, a big thanks to the organizers for inviting Civicus to speak in this webinar. As Teddy has mentioned, Civicus is a global civil society alliance. We've been tracking the state of civic space globally, and that includes freedom of expression, assembly, and association on our platform called the Civicus Monitor, which covers 196 countries around the world. And in recent months, we've been following very closely the impact of the pandemic on civic space. So I've been asked to answer the question whether Southeast Asian governments have taken advantage of the extended powers during the pandemic to violate fundamental freedoms. And what I will do is to look at the broader civic space violations that we have documented in the region and concerns raised by civil society. Before I end, I'll give a couple of examples related to freedom of religion and belief. As many of you are aware, even prior to the pandemic, the state of civic space in this region has already been quite dire. If you look at the map of civic space based on data collected from the Civicus Monitor platform, you will see 10 countries in the region where we have 4 countries where civic space that we rate as restricted: Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines. 4 which are considered repressed: Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Brunei, and 2 which we consider totally closed: Vietnam and Laos. So as you can see, the situation has been quite bleak even before the outbreak of the pandemic, based on research that we have undertaken. So moving on, if you look at the outbreak of the pandemic in the next slide, we saw numerous states impose emergency laws, decrees, or regulations to handle the pandemic. Under international human rights law, as many of us know, in the context of officially proclaimed public emergencies, including on public health, which threatens the life of a nation, restrictions on some rights can be justified. So for example, with regards to freedom of religion and belief, there may be some justification to limit the size of religious gatherings, including weddings, funerals, and so forth, to prevent the spread of COVID-19. However, this must be based on they must have a legal basis for this and be strictly necessary. It must be of limited duration. It must be respectful of human dignity. It must be subject to some form of review, either by parliament or some oversight process. It must be proportionate to achieving the objective of the emergency law. It must not involve any form of discrimination, and it must be used strictly to the extent required by the emergency in question. So there are very clear criteria that international law and standards impose on countries which pass emergency laws, decrees to deal with the pandemic. However, in the last 6 months, human rights groups, including Civicus, have documented numerous violations of fundamental freedoms across many countries in this region, and I will highlight some of these concerns. Firstly, we are concerned about emergency laws and regulations to combat the virus that have granted the state overtly broad powers. And one very clear example here is the decree passed by Prime Minister Hun Sen in Cambodia, containing many overtly broad and vague provisions, including unlimited surveillance of telecommunications, control of the media, control of social media, and so forth. In the Philippines, when an emergency law was passed in March, there were serious concerns raised by civil society over provisions in the law penalizing the spread of false information online, which was subsequently used to target journalists in the Philippines. So very broad and vague emergency laws are a serious concern. There have also been attempts to censor or restrict information on the COVID-19 pandemic. Here we know of Indonesia's President Joko Widodo admitting that he deliberately held back information about the spread of the coronavirus in its early months. In a country like Vietnam, where the state controls all conventional media and implements strict social media censorship, the authorities cracked down on people who were using both Facebook as well as bloggers who were trying to deliver timely and valuable information around the pandemic. We've also documented people who have been threatened or arrested for criticizing the state's response. Again, in Cambodia, we know of critics that have been targeted for asking questions about the pandemic, while unionists and workers' organizations have also been targeted for raising questions around the layoff of workers and so forth. Even in Thailand, an activist was charged under the draconian Computer Crimes Act for a Facebook post criticizing the lack of airport screening at the airport. We've also seen governments in this region target journalists for reporting on the pandemic, journalists who often are on the front line providing us with critical information on what's going on. And here, one glaring example is what happened here in Malaysia when Al Jazeera came under massive attack and scrutiny for a documentary on the inhumane treatment of migrant workers. Journalists were questioned by the police and accused of sedition and defamation. A migrant worker who spoke in that documentary had his visa revoked and was deported. In the Philippines, we know of top broadcaster ABS-CBN being forced off the air during a pandemic after the Philippines Congress refused to renew its license. Moving on to the next slide, we know also that the World Health Organization has raised serious concerns about an infodemic caused by a flood of false and misleading information about COVID. However, instead of combating this by facilitating access to information and debunking misinformation, we have seen countries increase the use of what they call anti-fake news laws to criminalize individuals. Here in Malaysia, at least 220 investigation papers have been opened up, with 24 individuals prosecuted for so-called spreading fake news. In Singapore, we know of the Protection on Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, POFMA, which also has been used to harass online critics during the pandemic. Civil society groups have also raised concerns about the use of excessive force or inhumane and degrading treatment by law enforcement officials towards people who have violated the lockdown in various countries. In the Philippines, we know of local officials who arrested individuals for violating the lockdown and putting them in dog cages and forcing them to sit in the midday sun as punishment. We know of also numerous other cases across this region of police officers going way too far beyond what is acceptable under international human rights law. Another concern is the state's increasing use of intrusive surveillance measures to combat the pandemic, which could have long-lasting consequences, and also increase in intolerance and xenophobia against migrants, refugees, as highlighted also by the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of religion and belief. Now, what about the impact of the pandemic on religion and belief? Here we have documented concerns raised by groups about attempts to push forward laws during the pandemic related to freedom of religion and belief without adequate consultation to impose discriminatory regulations. And the pandemic has also been used as a pretext to collect biometric data on religious minorities. One very clear example is in Indonesia, where there's been an ongoing discussion to expand provisions on blasphemy in the penal code. Indonesian officials are attempting to expand this blasphemy law from one provision to 6, criminalizing persuading somebody to be a non-believer, disturbing a religious ritual, or making noise near a house of worship, or insulting a cleric while leading a ritual. The debates on this bill were postponed in September 2019 after widespread demonstrations against the changes in the law. However, out of a sudden in April 2020, with the outbreak of the pandemic, the Indonesian parliament called for the resumption of deliberations on the bill at a time when civil society and other stakeholders would find it extremely difficult to engage with this law or even to hold protests. So a very clear example of how a law was being bulldozed through parliament. In Malaysia, we saw discriminatory provisions being imposed against the exercise of freedom of religion. And I know Nalini will speak more about this later. In June 2020, the government began resuming Muslim Friday prayers in mosques. However, foreigners were banned from the mosque. The decision occurred around the same time where there was massive harassment and xenophobia against Rohingya refugees who were accused of spreading disease, burdening the state, and taking jobs. In Thailand, a final example, over the last few years, there's been ongoing collection of biometric data of Muslim minorities in Thailand as part of the counterinsurgency strategies. Authorities have been actively collecting DNA samples from Malay Muslims during search at military checkpoints. And we know that many of them who were returning from Malaysia when the outbreak happened were forced to give their DNA collection under the pretext of COVID-19. I will now end off with a couple of recommendations. I think it's very important that this forum discuss the issue of safeguarding freedom of expression in all its forms while addressing the pandemic, and to create an enabling environment for civil society and activists, including those working on freedom of religion and belief. It's important that any deliberation of bills in parliament or policies during the pandemic, particularly that impact on civic freedoms and freedom of religion and belief, must be done in accordance with democratic norms with adequate consultation from civil society and affected groups. Further, all regulations, including those related to civic freedoms during the pandemic, must ensure they do not discriminate against individuals, including religious minorities. And finally, any personal biometric data collected during the pandemic from religious minorities must be only used for the purposes of responding to the pandemic and are lawful, necessary, proportionate, and time-bound. I will end my presentation here, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for that very comprehensive, even if very brief report, well within 10 minutes. But I'd also like to thank you and Civicus for the Herculean task of monitoring human rights violations on freedom of religion or belief, as well as other human rights all over the region. And many of the recommendations that you've presented in your second to the last slide would be very helpful for us parliamentarians as a guide in our legislative work. So now let's proceed to the second speaker. He is Dr. Robin Ramcharan, the Executive Director of Asia Center, and he holds a PhD in international relations from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. He has 25 years of expertise in the Southeast Asia and Pacific region on issues relating to democracy, human rights, and the new media. Dr. Robin will examine the limitation to freedom of speech during COVID-19 and its impact to religious communities. He will also elaborate how hate speech has proliferated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's now hear from Dr. Robin Ramcharan.
Robin, please unmute your microphone so we can hear you. Thank you.
Let me start again. Thank you all. Thank you for the generous introduction. And thank you to the co-organizers for inviting me to present Asia Center's work on hate speech, COVID-19, democracy in the region, and so on. And I'm very pleased to see older and newer friends, and welcome to you all. Similarly with Joseph, I have a PowerPoint that I would like to share with you. So allow me one second to upload that. Please let me know if you can see it. I trust you all can see that. Okay, so I would like to speak about the themes that the kind chair mentioned. I would like to speak about those issues all around this issue of hate speech in Southeast Asia. And so I would like to present to you a report that we have done, finished, compiled recently in cooperation with the Thai Media Fund. And so there is are the contents of this report. And I would like to point out some of the key features of this report, talk about the place of FoRB, and also conclude with some recommendations. So let me start with this. So one of perhaps the key point that we emphasize in this report is that we have identified 4 forms of hate speech in Southeast Asia in recent times. Hate speech related to race and religion, and that's the older form. Foreign nationals, migrant workers, and refugees. Political ideology and values, and sexual minorities. So the second, third, and fourth are the newer forms. And what we are suggesting is that regulation and policies have to be adjusted to accommodate these 3 newer forms of hate speech. Joseph just mentioned, for example, discrimination against the Rohingya. Well, the Rohingya, marginalized communities, migrant workers, and refugees. Let me continue on the topic of race and religion. Race and religion, of course, was the original or the first area of focus in terms of concern for hate speech. And that was, I suppose, natural in the context of post-colonial states, which were concerned with maintaining harmony, maintaining ethnic and religious harmony. And so that's where we started. But now we see these 3 other manifestations. Let me just throw in here my own observations, our own observations on COVID and faith groups at this time. I would like to echo the words of Ahmed Shahid, the Special Rapporteur on FoRB, who noted in an April 2020 call or even alarm that faith groups are under attack in some senses. Christian, Jewish, Muslim groups were being affected negatively. And he called on, of course, as Joseph was just pointing out, respect for fundamental rights, including to FoRB. I would say that the pandemic has accentuated and accelerated existing trends. And so hate speech is one such trend. And in the context of Thailand, as was just mentioned, you obviously have the broader context of Muslim, Southern Muslim identity versus a larger Buddhist majority. And in that context, one has to place hate speech in that larger context. In our hate speech conference that just concluded, conference on hate speech from 7 to 9th of October, researchers here in Thailand showed, based on their empirical research, increasing amounts of hate speech towards the Muslim community on social media, increasing use of discriminatory language and hateful content. Suspicion of the Muslim communities was evident in mainstream media as well, and there were stories about pilgrimages being undertaken from southern states to Indonesia and bringing back the COVID-19 virus. As was also mentioned, there were restrictions on worship and assembly. I think that's a universal phenomenon, restrictions on assembly, which were by and large accepted. But those restrictions, for example, in relation to various faith communities, for example, the Christian community began to be lifted from June onwards. As was noted, there was also increased surveillance in these COVID times through the tracing apps. And now colleagues from Thailand here present in this discussion may correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that these tracing apps, the information collected, which is supposed to be private and for the Ministry of Health or the health authorities, but those, it was revealed, are also being shared with the defense authorities. So that's one concern. You have the issue of registration of chips, you have racial profiling, and you have facial recognition technology, all of which are being used to heighten surveillance in the middle of this context, accelerating, I think, again, existing trends. We should note that faith leaders have collaborated with health authorities with regard to respecting health directives. And I would note, for example, Muslim youth associations in the South, which have collaborating in making videos to encourage compliance with these regulations. So let me come back to the wider picture across the region. Joseph was giving us a regional perspective. We also take a regional perspective. And so here, what has been done to address hate speech in general? So we see legal measures, harmony bills and commissions, the use of existing laws, penal codes, the Computer Crime Act here in Thailand, the Electronic Information and Transactions Law in Indonesia, COVID-19 related laws, especially those related to fake news, so-called fake news, right? You see on the right-hand side of your screen, harmony laws in Malaysia. The Harmony Commission was created. In Myanmar, the Protection Against Hate Speech Bill. In the Philippines, House Bill 3672 on the Hate Speech Act. Maintenance of Religious Harmony Bill in Singapore. Policies and practices that have been pursued in relation to addressing hate speech across these 6 areas. So of direct relevance to us are the guidelines for religious practices, integration activities. I will come back to that in a little while when we talk about recommendations. I would note the importance, the relevance of the ICERD convention and the gap in the region, or at least one lacuna, and that is the 3 countries that have not yet signed the ICERD. There was a discussion about it in Malaysia, but it was pulled back, I think, as we all know. So Brunei, Malaysia, Myanmar should join. The ICERD has, reporting to the ICERD has important features, important merits. We also looked at the role of technology companies and what roles do they have? Flagging content, content management, and account suspension. So technology companies have an important role to play here, and they need to be held to account, and they need to act faster. So coming to concrete recommendations, one of the key recommendations that we make is we suggest a broadening of the definition of hate speech. Race and religion are, of course, remain important. Hate speech, to combat hate speech on those grounds, but also we argue for widening it to the 3 other forms. Of course, put in protective measures. One of the key recommendations is to revisit and amend vaguely worded laws and orders. And as Joseph was just pointing out, we need to make sure that the 3-part test is adhered to when limiting rights. And Joseph mentioned the tests, the three elements: legality, proportionality, and necessity. Secondary recommendations relate to the 6 areas: government agencies, language policy, ethnic and racial policies, religious guidelines, integration activities. So here, the key point, message that we want to get across is that as we adopt policies across all of these areas, we must make sure that they are not counteracting each other. If you're going to have policies on social harmony, then how useful is it to then view integration activities and so on from the perspective of internal security perspective? Why not the rights perspective from the social harmony perspective? And the 2 may be at odds, for example. And finally, I will end here on the role of technology companies. I think they do have an important role to play in terms of hate speech in general, and also certainly there should be a discussion in terms of FoRB issues, freedom of religion or belief on social media, in the online space. And we recommend that tech companies uphold their very standards, right? To begin with, that they deploy adequate resources and that they be more proactive in addressing hate speech. And the last thought on all of this is one of the key questions that we had in our conference, both on fake news last year and on hate speech this year, is what is the role of regulation? Can we regulate our way out of this scourge, if you want to call it that way? And I think the answer overwhelmingly was that yes, regulation is needed, but it's not the only answer, and maybe it's not even the main answer. We need a variety of approaches, including fact-checking, media literacy, and having a more proactive role of tech companies, to name 2 or 3. So let me end it there, and I turn over the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Again, for keeping within the time limit, and also, of course, for sharing your insights on the situation on anti-hate speech legislation throughout the region. I think I learned something today because as a parliamentarian from the Philippines, I used to think that anti-hate speech legislation was not that relevant. But now I've learned that there's also hate speech against the LGBT community, against people with political ideologies and beliefs. So now I'll be a supporter of that Hate Speech Act in the Philippines. And also thank you for giving us concrete recommendations on what we parliamentarians can do in our own respective parliaments. So now we go to our third speaker, and she is Nalini Elumalay, who is a grassroots activist and human rights advocate. Nalini is the Malaysia Program Officer of Article 19, and outside of her day job, she is also actively involved with grassroots movement concerning the rural poor and plantation workers. Prior to joining an international organization, Nalini held an 8-year tenure with Suara Rakyat Malaysia, or SWARAM, as the campaign coordinator, and then steering the organization forward as its executive director. Nalini will elaborate on the international standards related to countering hate speech. I think this is very important for parliamentarians. While we always think of our own national context, it's also important to have knowledge on global standards, on human rights, as well as how to combat hate speech, which would include the UN guidance notes on addressing and countering COVID-19 related hate speech. She will also talk about Article 19's work on hate speech. Ms. Nalini, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks firstly to the organizer for inviting Article 19 to be part of this panel. Thanks to my previous two speakers for all your insights. I have a PowerPoint presentation as well. Can I have it? Okay. Okay, I think we can just go to the next slides, today's focus. As mentioned by Teddy, I think there are two things that I want to mention. I'm sorry, I hope Malaysia is not taking a lot of space in this discussion, but just briefly about what we have observed at Article 19, because Article 19's work on countering hate speech is a main work in Malaysia at this time. So I'll be focusing on very briefly on hate speech amidst COVID-19 in Malaysia, and also available guidance documents to counter hate speech. So as Teddy mentioned, of course, is international standards. And then there are a lot of people been asking like how to localize the international standards into our work. So it might not be the answers to it, but then I think we can actually go through to see like what actually can fit for our countries. Yeah. So the first is like very briefly, like what happened in Malaysia amidst of COVID-19. So the Rohingya refugees, I'm sure like everyone heard of it, the Rohingya refugees were stopped, and then they were sent, the boats were sent back to sea. What happened during that time is like campaigns by Facebook groups, both private and public Facebook groups, and then it created and targeted coordinated hate speech against them. In our observation and also documentation, we saw so many Facebook groups were created, just for, to create a hostile environment against the Rohingya refugees. We also saw a lot of YouTube videos has been created with a lot of misinformation, factually wrong videos has been spread around. And we also saw like some of the videos, YouTube videos, they have like 100,000 subscribers, and then people have watched a lot of that videos. And we also have online petitions that was created in Change.org. So we actually reported so many of it, and it was 28 online petition was created and 27 was removed at that point of time when we were monitoring. So there are so many efforts, coordinated efforts were taken by some groups, some people to actually to create the hostile environment against the Rohingyas, and also, and after that, migrants. But the most important issue that come out of this entire hate speech during this in April was that the government has not taken any action against the perpetrators of the hate speech. We actually, Article 19, together with 80 over international NGOs, local NGOs, and regional NGOs, sent an open letter to the government of Malaysia to take action against those perpetrators, but nothing has been done so far. Next slide. The post hate speech, as Joe mentioned, we can see like some public and private groups in FB still remains talking about Rohingya refugees, migrants, and we have seen a couple of people actually flag off to Article 19 in all these private groups. And Reuters recently came out with an article basically focusing on all these private groups in Facebook. And like Joe mentioned, that one of the Bangladeshi worker who spoke in Al Jazeera video has been deported back, and many others, migrants. Foreigners, refugees, migrants were not allowed to go to the place of worship. So you can see the some of the articles from the government agencies saying that, and also the minister saying that mosque is only for Malaysian for now, not for the foreigners. Not allowed to open their businesses, which was allowed before. Foreigners, Rohingya refugees are not allowed to enter markets, migrants also. And the online attacks is still going on in Malaysia against these Rohingya refugees and migrants. Next. So what we learned from this entire incident that happened from April to May, we learned, and we actually very concerned that it's time for us to promote inclusion, diversity, and pluralism in Malaysia. We need more informed speech is needed to tackle hate. Open space for dialogue, debate, and dissent, including controversial topics, must be allowed. And we need to talk about these issues and allow hate speech to be countered online and offline. People need to know how to counter hate speech as well. Responses must be clear and contextualized understanding of the problem. And of course, require collection of evidence and data, which must be including on the basis of gender. So we have learned this throughout these incidents, and we actually proposing how we want to work in Malaysia right after the hate speech against Rohingyas and migrants. We actually try to work in terms of how we can approach other stakeholders to create awareness and to talk about these issues morely. So I'm going to go into the international framework and guidance. I think the first one is the just before we getting into this international framework, I just want to for us to remember that I know that people are talking about how to localize these international standards in our work and in our country, but we also remember that all these international standards or mechanism that I'm going to mention is a couple of documents later is actually a documentations of people who came for the expert consultations. For example, the UN resolution, Rabat Plan of Action, it included the opinions and also ideas from all these stakeholders who came for the meetings, who actually spoke about what we can do to counter hate speech. So international standards or the mechanism is not something that just jump from the sky, but it's actually it's created and developed through a consultation. So it's also involved a very grassroots kind of discussions as well. But the question is like how we want to localize and how we want to implement this in our countries. So just going to the UN resolution 1618. So I'm sure you have heard of this UN resolution 1618. It's basically was adopted in 2011 for combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, and stigmatization and discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. So it sets us a universally agreed action plan by states for addressing intolerance on the basis of religion or belief. So it's basically, it's for the states how they can counter hate speech and how they can actually promote inclusion and diversity. So this resolution sets on the rationale that the promotion of inclusion, diversity, and pluralism is the best antidote to counter intolerant expression, and also coupled with the policies and laws to tackle the root causes of hate speech and discrimination. So if you see in the slides, you can see there's like 8 points, 5A, 5B, and 5C. So among the 8 points, 7 points are actually highlighting how we can promote measures to increase freedom of expression, how to promote inclusion, and how to take initiative to basically to have a pluralism kind of environment in our countries. There's only one point, which is 5F, is talking about limiting on freedom of expression or expression that that incites violence or harm. So, basically this entire UN resolution 1618 is to help to guide the state. And we all have responsibility as well to making sure the state is also taking all the initiative that has been pointed out in the resolution. This is one of the main element of it that I would like to state it here. And the next slide. So how the UN resolution 1618 has been implemented or been taken into practice is like through the Istanbul process. So the Istanbul process is a series of meetings initiated in 2011 to promote and guide implementation of resolution 1618 and conceive as a space for various stakeholders to exchange the good practices and experiences. And it's also have a potential to be a strong vehicle to identify and replicate innovative and human rights compatible approaches to promote inclusive and pluralism and diversity. And Article 19 been involved in this Istanbul process, and we had the last meeting in 2019 in Hague, and we actually had a lot of discussions with so many other stakeholders and states who presented in the meeting, and it's an ongoing process. The next slide. So we have this website that we actually work together with the Universal Rights Group. So you can get all the info about Istanbul process from this internet website, Istanbul process 1618 info. So you can actually go and see what are the best practices being shared around the world through this website, and what are the efforts are being taken by various stakeholders and states around the world. The next. So the next one is Rabat Plan of Action. So it's basically was developed by the international expert with the support of the OSCHR. It adopted in 2012, provides practical, legal, and policy guidance to states on implementing Article 20. It's basically Rabat Plan of Action unpacked the Article 20 of the ICCPR by setting out clear guidance on the exceptional circumstances in which the most severe hate speech should be limited. And also, while Article 2012 ICCPR address incitement on the basis of race, religion, and nationality, but there's an obligation for the state to apply to all the protected characteristics under the international law. So it's basically unpacked the Article 22 of the ICCPR, and also it also set out a positive policies measures to address the root causes of discrimination and multi-stakeholder approach. So next. So if you can see the Rabat Plan of Action, it has a whole of society approach to promoting inclusion, diversity, and pluralism. So you can see there are a lot of multi-stakeholders involved in countering hate speech: media, politicians and political parties, civil societies, national human rights institutions, religious leaders, and civil societies. And basically Article 19 in Malaysia is using this model as one of the way to do our work in Malaysia. Next slide. So you can see the Article 19 Malaysia program is we have a couple of programs like engage with religious leaders and community and media, provide trainings for National Human Rights Commission, civil servants to promote inclusiveness towards minorities, national conference with various stakeholders, capacity building for trainings for CSOs and youths. And for the first time last year, we actually managed to do a training for the civil servants for the first time, also because there's a change of government and we had a lot of expectation that we can engage more with the civil servants and the government and we can provide more trainings. But unfortunately, that has changed now and we have to back to square one. But these are some of the efforts that we have to. In fact, the training for the civil servant was requested by the minister themselves from Article 19 to do the training. So that was the environment before the change of government in March before that. The next. So this is the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech. It was launched in 2019 by the United Nations Secretary General. For the first time, the Secretary General proposes a working definition of hate speech. It's very close to, we can say it's a definition of hate speech to drive the UN response to hate speech. So hate speech in this particular document is framed for the purpose of the strategy as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses discriminatory language with reference to a person or group on the basis of who they are, in other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. So it's the next slide. So basically the objective of this UN strategy and plan of action is like, one, to enhance UN efforts to address the root causes and drivers of hate speech, and to enable effective UN responses to impact of hate speech on society and victim. And you can see there are 13 commitments by the UN themselves. So it's basically, we can use this UN strategy and action plan, and we can actually work together with UN in your country residence or your OSCHR office in the region, and we can collaborate together with them to make sure that UN play a very important role to counter hate speech nationally and locally in each country. So this is a guidance for them, and they also have come up with very detailed guidance on this UN strategy, and I can share all this document later, but you can see there is a lot of commitments from the UN. So I think as a civil societies, most of us are civil society working in the national level or regional, we can use this as a platform to approach UN and make sure they also actively play a role whenever that we do something or anything to do with countering hate speech in our country. Next. I think I have covered this. And other documents that I'm going to just briefly go is Beirut Declaration 80 Convention, is Faith for Rights. It's basically, it's on the religion, freedom of religion. This framework provides space for cross-disciplinary reflection and action on the deep and mutual enriching connection between religions and human rights. So you can actually find this in the documents, and I can share later. And then we have Article 19 Hate Speech Toolkit, multi-stakeholder approach. So we actually have using this, our toolkit for so many trainings, as well as for our advocacy work. So there are a lot of suggestions like, and ideas, and what we can do with media, and what we can do with how to partnership with media, and how to approach the religious leaders or religious groups. And so you can see in our Article 19 toolkit. And then we have this Global Compact for Migration. This is like 23 objectives in the Global Compact are all relevant to fostering climates where inclusion and diversity and pluralism are respected. The next. So I think the most important is the implementation is the key. So first, a proactive and positive approach to challenge the rising of intolerance and promoting inclusion, diversity, and pluralism in tackling hate and discrimination. The state should lead by example at the national level, in line with the Human Rights Resolution 1680 and Rabat Plan of Action. Number two, mobilizing all stakeholders, creating inclusive environment, and we can use Rabat Plan of Action and Camden Principles of Article 19, and we can see how we can implement that in our countries. And number three is enhancing multilateral efforts. This is again go back to the UN Resolution 1618 and how we can actually make effective implementation by the state in the respective countries, and also the enhanced Istanbul process. I think maybe lots of other key holders should join this Istanbul process and to exchange best practices that we have in our countries. And thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Nadini, for elaborating on the international standards. I think that's really important information for parliamentarians, particularly in addressing the question on how to localize international standards or international agreements. So let's proceed immediately to our fourth and last speaker, and then afterwards we will have the question and answer session. We will have Mr. Diki Sofan, sorry if I mispronounce your name, who is a prominent intellectual and social activist in the fields of religion and politics, religious literacy and harmony, ethics, minority studies, human dignity, public diplomacy, and the environment. Dr. Dickey will speak about the responses by religious groups to the limitations on the freedom of assembly or religious gatherings and examine whether or not the restrictions are legitimate. Mr. Dickey, please.
Well, thank you very much, Teddy. And thank you very much, APHR, the IPP FoRB, and also Stephanus Alliance for the gracious invitation. I'm still waiting for my presentation to be put up. But I'm from the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, which is a consortium of 3 universities based in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So comprising Universitas Gadjah Mada, the Islamic University, and also the Christian University. And so it's a real pleasure and honor to be sharing my insights on this COVID-19 pandemic and how it has had a negative impact on human rights and freedom of religion or belief, most notably in Indonesia. But I guess taking a different approach from my previous colleagues who presented earlier, I'd like to take a more sort of reflective sociological approach to the problem and see the kinds of negative consequences, both direct and indirect, on the state of human rights and freedom of religion or belief in Indonesia. Currently, we have 365,000 positive cases of COVID-19, in which among them 289,000 have been cured, but the death toll has been quite significant, which is almost reaching 13,000. And having said that, I'd just like to state that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has now gone on for 7 months, has really taught us the meaning of isolation, quarantine, lockdowns, and social physical distancing. I mean, people around the world now have a whole new set of vocabularies related to the pandemic. And by vocabularies, I mean that they have developed this new way of looking at the world, at social reality, at religious life, and politics as well. As we have witnessed lately during this lockdown, we have seen in different parts of the world, both the best and the worst, form of humanity. On the one hand, we can see people, helping each other and providing resources and lending, helping hands and giving food charity to those in need, during this pandemic, and actually helping complete strangers to provide them with food and shelter and so on. But we have also seen, on the other hand, this development of a psyche, a social psyche, whereby people are increasingly becoming afraid of strangers, afraid of the others, having their villages locked down and really questioning anyone who would be coming into their villages or their towns or their cities and their perhaps apartment complex and residences. And this is quite unfortunate because, this has developed into some form of alienation, suffered on the part of a lot of people who are suffering from this pandemic, especially those who have been alienated and those who have been so-called rationalized, using the Indonesian lingo, or asked to return home due to the closure of the factories, companies, and projects, and so on. And thus we have seen wave of people, wage earners, going back to their villages and rural areas because they could not live in the cities and urban centers because they have no more earnings. I think the worst case you can see of this was in India, whereby following the sort of exodus of these wage earners, you see a lot of people dying on the streets and going hungry and even being sexually abused along the way, and so on and so forth. And so, but you know, to reflect on this pandemic, we need to also just go back one step and look at how Indonesia was previously, prior to the pandemic. And actually before that, we have seen a drastic rise in social, religious, and political intolerance. I think there have been many studies by academics, both Indonesians and from overseas, who have made the conclusion that right after Reformasi, that we have experienced what's called a conservative turn, where you see this alliance of political religious movements and this insistence on a more sort of conservative religious lifestyle and political norms, and this sort of perpetual yearning for a strong leadership to come to the fore to sort of mobilize you know, the righteous people. But another interrelated phenomenon that we saw prior to the pandemic was also this idea about the shrinking civil society. And I think there have been some research and studies being done on this as well. And so this is a direct sort of byproduct of the victory of the popular president Joko Widodo in 2014, where we have seen the systematic sort of sidelining of civil society organizations and even mainstream religious groups throughout Indonesia as a result of this growing assertiveness of the central government and the popularity of Jokowi. And of course, with the conservative turn, together with a shrinking of civil society, what follows logically is, you know, the furthering of discrimination against vulnerable groups and marginalized communities, and further sort of incitement to violence and hate speeches against them. But I can also recognize that this is not happening only in Indonesia, but also in other parts of Southeast Asia and even other parts of the world. So next, please. Yeah, so this is, that was a picture of a prohibition in my village for strangers to come. So the current mosque in my village prohibits any strangers to come into the mosque and to pray. And obviously this gives a very sort of, I mean, this is really unprecedented for any mosque really in Indonesia to prohibit anyone from engaging in congregational prayers. And as you can see in the picture, that, you know, people are adhering to the physical distancing rule, and that even as they pray, that they are abiding by the rules of the government. And next, please. Well, if you look at the perspective from the religious authorities, we have the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, which is the Indonesian Council of Ulamas, which supposedly represents the mainstream Muslim groups. You can see that there is this overwhelming support from the religious authorities on the sort of basic restrictions, you know, upheld by the government with respect to, you know, religious worship, congregational prayers, Friday prayers, and as you can remember recently, that it's really the first time for, you know, somebody my age who's almost 50, for the first time not being able to enjoy, you know, the worship during the Ramadan period, where we usually have this tarawih or the night prayers, where there'll be many people going to the mosque and so on. And this also goes to two of the most you know, celebrated Islamic holidays, which is Idul Fitr and Idul Adha. None of us went to the fields and did the congregational prayer. So in that sense, the government did receive a lot of you know, positive responses and support from the religious authorities and the mainstream religious groups. But I guess what they didn't anticipate was some of the unintended consequences of that. Next. And one of the consequences of that was this direct assault on democracy through the use of public health. And we can see that as much as the government was very confident and insistent on restricting religious worship and congregational prayers and all, but yet we are also seeing an insistence on the part of the President Jokowi and also the majority political parties that support him on their insistence on the holding of the direct local elections. And so I'm going to look at this just very quickly on two things, two recent developments. One is the decision by the government to conduct the direct local elections, and also the recently ratified omnibus law, which focuses on the amended labor law. Next, please. As you can probably see around the world, that there have been this insistence on various governments, including in Singapore and also in the US, that that the government, that the powers that be want elections to continue. And I'm guessing that this has probably to do with the kinds of investments and political investments and financial investments put in the political parties and the candidates who have been put there to run, including President Jokowi's son and son-in-law, who are vying for positions in Solo, in Central Java, and also North Sumatra. So we do sense also a sort of conflict of interest and a clear problem in terms of how the government is weighing the consequences of, on the one hand, protecting public health from the virus, but on the other hand, insisting on the ongoing plans for the direct local elections to be upheld. Next. The other one concerns the omnibus law, and as we have seen in recent weeks, there have been strong resistance from the Islamic organizations, namely the Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, who basically have seen this omnibus law as a way for the government to sort of sneak in, the law and to pass laws that are sensitive and might infringe the rights of certain segments of society. But basically, some of the sort of essential critiques of this include the economic rights of laborers, their rights to holidays and so on, but also the farmers and basically the pro-poor legislations and the rights of the poor people. But then one of the other major issue concerns the environment, that there is this disregard of the environment and this sort of constant pushing for the support of big corporations and investments coming from overseas at the expense of the small and medium sized local enterprises. Next, please. This is the one of the major critiques on the omnibus law and the direct consequences of the resistance against it from the environmental group, and looking at different conflicts and problems occurring in different provinces and districts with respect to the environment and the major corporations and the local people, including the indigenous communities in Kalimantan, who have taken a real beating due to this liberalization. Next, please. So I'd like to reflect on all of these, and basically, I mean, this is really the first time for us to see a convergence of religion, politics, and public health. I think this is the first time that I'm experiencing it, and I'm sure that most of us here are experiencing it for the first time. But this obviously, requires us to rethink about how we think about religion, how we think about politics, and how we think about public health, and how when they are converged, that it has consequences on the basic fundamentals of our rights. And then we also notice that people have different perceptions of the pandemic, and even among the religious people, you see this sort of total disregard for the virus on the one hand, but also people who are also engaging in what people would say scientism. Yeah, so sort of disregarding the all sort of metaphysical explanations of the pandemic. But then we're also seeing the unleashing of the power of oligarchy and political patronage. We've seen this in Indonesia with the omnibus law and the direct local elections, but we are also seeing this in other countries as well. The pandemic has also unmasked the social inequalities in society, most notably for the, within the context of the omnibus law, we have seen that this will ultimately be affecting the job market, the employment, the education, and social benefits, especially for the poor people. And lastly, I think there is a decline of democracy and participation in this pandemic, I think throughout Southeast Asia and also other parts of the world. And this has created the social distrust in society toward the government, toward the religious authorities and others. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that these developments have indeed both directly and indirectly caused the the disregard for fundamental rights and the more prioritization of politics in society today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diki, for a very insightful, even philosophical discussion of the impacts of COVID-19 in our society, also sharing some of the issues in Indonesia. So we've had stories or sharings of Rohingyan, the difficulties of the Rohingyans and migrants in general in Malaysia, as well as the discrimination against faith groups in Thailand, even a regional overview of what's happening, including in my country, in the Philippines, as well as discussion on the global standards, which I think is very important for a lot of parliamentarians. So I would like to congratulate and thank our resource persons for very informative, very comprehensive reports. And so now we go to the fun part, which is the question and answer session. And as I mentioned at the start of our webinar, you can either say it by raising your hand or encoding your questions in the chat box. We will have the Secretariat helping us in relaying your questions to me. But I'd like to take the first crack, and this is addressed to any of the panelists. Now, as I mentioned, in the Philippines, discussions on hate speech hasn't really been that exhaustive, because initially we felt that this was not a big or relevant issue in the Philippine Parliament. But I know it's real, and I've learned something from your sharings. And so I'd like to ask the panelists, what do you think can parliamentarians and FoRB advocates do to counter COVID-19 related hate speech? So any one of you can answer? Maybe the four of you, if you wish.
Maybe I can start.
Sure, DK, please do.
Yeah, well, basically, even prior to the pandemic, we have had problems of hate speech. And I think the height of the hate speech, from my observation, was particularly experienced during the height of the war in Syria. And as we know, there have been, or there had been previously, this propping up of many Facebook groups that are anti-Shias, and claiming that this war in Syria is against Bashar al-Assad, who happens to be Shias and so on. Although obviously some of us know that that is not true. But then we have seen also other attempts at engaging in religious hate groups against other minorities, like the Ahmadis and the Gafatars or the Mila Abraham group now. But that has very much been tackled by the government through its use of the ITE law, or the Internet and the Electronic Transaction Law, which in one of its article, namely Article 28, that the government has been bashing on these groups and closing down websites and Facebook groups and so on that are engaging in hate speech against religious minorities and so on. So what my observation tells me is that there had been a decrease in that, but as a consequence of that is that the government seemed to have learned that using the ITE law is quite effective in sort of toning down any forms of resistance or even criticisms toward the government of any kind. And I think this harks back to what Joseph was earlier saying about the use of the internet laws in some of the countries in Southeast Asia. And I think also Robin mentioned this in Thailand and in other countries. So I think what this pandemic has made is to sort of give a blank check to the government to actually use this to downplay any forms of criticism toward them, and using even remote criticisms of certain public officials would be considered as hate speech. And we have seen this during the demonstrations, protest, and resistance against the holding of the planned local direct elections and also the omnibus law.
Okay, thanks, Dicky. That was quite helpful. Would any of the panelists also like to add something? Robin, please go ahead.
If I may, I would just like to maybe answer, come to your, directly to your specific question. What can parliamentarians do? And I think it's very important to ponder this question, because parliamentarians themselves are the subject of much hate speech. And in an era when, when there is so much mistrust of politicians in general, I think it's critical that there be a dialogue between parliamentarians and the public. And parliamentarians have to go, of course, parliamentarians here do it, engage with those who are not your natural constituents. Go on the opposing sides, whoever they are, media networks, and dialogue. I think that is very important. And I think parliamentarians have to keep the issue alive, of course, in Parliament as well, through select committees and so on. Of course, considering and revising laws and refining definitions and policies. And last thing I would like to mention is that parliamentarians can have a hand in creating independent bodies, maybe at the national level and at the regional level. That is one of our recommendations, to have these independent bodies, and perhaps even a regional one, because at the end of the day also is the issue of who defines hate speech. And do we want to leave this solely up to the government or governments? And the experience of the POFMA legislation in Singapore it requires more analysis, but I think we should follow that closely in terms of who can define what exactly is hate speech or fake news and so on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robin, for that very concrete recommendation. Helps me a lot, as a parliamentarian who's been a target of a lot of hate speech. But as an indigenous person, I think it's important that dialogue, because that's the way of the IPs, that we engage in a lot of dialogues. I see that Birgit has a question. Just go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Birgitte with the Stephanus Alliance. We are a co-host of this webinar and the FoRB conference. First of all, let me just thank all of the presenters here today for excellent insight and presentations. I think we've heard from very different perspectives on the COVID-19 pandemic and how it relates to religious and belief communities in Southeast Asia. First of all, I just want to mention that the presentations that have been shared here today will be sent out to you through email after this webinar. And I see that some of the presenters have also shared in the chat box the very links to their reports. I do have a question, and it's a bit different than the one you started on hate speech. I have a question to Joseph and the presentation that you started on. You mentioned several very worrying trends in Southeast Asia amid the pandemic. One of them was how the COVID-19 was used as a pretext to collect privacy data and biometric data on Muslims in south of Thailand. And I think given what we see in China and also happening in India with the collection of biometric data, particularly pertaining to minorities, this is extremely concerning how those kind of data can be misused under the pretext of security, or in this case even health. There are also rumors that Myanmar is planning to open a biometric database for its whole population. So my question is whether you see this as a wider trend in Southeast Asia, the collection of biometric data, particularly on religious or ethnic communities. And are you worried at all that this is open for exploitation? Both Thailand and Myanmar have, government is very closely related to the military. And as you say, the data in Thailand was indeed shared with the defense ministry. So what do you see as potential challenges and pitfalls, particularly for civil society to be engaged with when it comes to holding government accountable on these things? Thank you.
Can I respond, Teddy, to that? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bridget. I think this is a really important question, because obviously we are seeing these forms of surveillance and data retention of data being collected in not just in Southeast Asia but across the globe. And this is what Civicus has been seeing from the information that we've collected over the last 6 months. And obviously many of these are being bulldozed without adequate consultation with relevant stakeholders. Civil society in many places have been sidelined from that process, even including tech companies who may also be able to provide advice around issues around privacy and so forth. And I think here, for example, in the example I gave of Thailand, it was journalists who were uncovering what was happening in the south, because of the fact that they were already reporting on what's going on there. And I think there's a very important role of the media in being able to document what these issues and be able to expose them when they're happening. So that I think is a very critical aspect of civic freedoms, but also oversight. What form of oversight do these tools and tactics being used by the government? What can exist? Is there oversight from Parliament? Are there independent bodies looking at where this data is going to? Who is using it at the end of the day? And I think there's serious questions being raised by civil society in a number of countries in this region about that. Also, the coding behind that, is that transparent? Is that open access? I think these are multiple questions that at least Civicus has seen in this region, and I think there needs to be steps taken by different stakeholders to ensure that the data is only used to address the pandemic and not for purposes then that could be used against the communities and civil society in the long term. So I think there are definitely issues there that need to be interrogated.
You okay with that, Bridget?
Yes, thank you so much. I do think this is a trend that we should keep an eye on. Thank you.
Okay. I see Kun Kasit raising his hand. Yes, but
Teddy,
yes.
Thank you to all
Yeah.
the panelists and question and so on. My suggestion to the panel, and I think to the three sponsor or the organizer of this event, is to have a joint letter to the Prime Minister of Thailand concerning the outflow of data from the health authorities to the defense authority. There is a national COVID coordinating committee based at the Prime Minister's office. So we can write to the Prime Minister to ensure that there is no misusing of the data. That's the first point. The second point is that we can, or even APHR, can write to individual members of parliaments of Thailand who are Muslims, especially from the southern provinces. And third, we have the Civilian Development Cooperation Unit in the south also, based I think in Yala. We can also write to this center to ensure that data are properly used and not to be abused. And at the same time, I think we should urge the Muslims religious authority in Thailand to speak directly to the government that there will not be any abuses of the data pertaining to the Muslim minorities in Thailand. So a couple of suggestions so that we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Kasit, for that very helpful suggestions as to next steps. Kun Kasit is a member of the board of PHR. I have a question in the chat group. I took it down, and I'd like to address this to Nandini because she has worked with community organizations. And the question is, how can community-based organizations also mitigate hate speech? I guess in the arena of where they're working in.
Thank you for the questions. I think I can give one example. So we had a meeting a week ago in Northern State. We actually went to meet this religious community-based organization. So we actually met with some of the leaders of the organization, and we asked, I mean, there was a discussion and conversation. Basically, we started off with conversation about issues that are going on and misconception of religion generally in Malaysia. So when we were discussing, having this conversation, we can see the lack of understanding on freedom of expression, but also lack of understanding on religion and all sort of things. So when we actually talked to them, and there was a lot of suggestions from the community leaders, like whether we can do a forum or sessions with other members of the organizations, and whether we can actually talk freely on how this misconception on religion is actually, I mean, it's creating a very hostile environment, but how each faith or religion can actually work together to unite and promote tolerance, for example. So we actually exchange ideas, and all the ideas came from the community-based leaders. They actually suggested, like, can we do this topic? Can we have the conversation on this? Because we think this is more important to the region at that point of, and particular issue is very important, so that more people from members of the church or the other religion can learn the misconception. So it's basically, for, if you ask me, it's more like a conversation and dialogues. And I think for the community organization, they don't speak our language. They don't speak international standard. They don't speak, this is hate speech, this is, you know. So what we usually do as a community organizer, we usually have issues on the end. We have a lot of issues in Malaysia, for example. So every issues have lots of how we want to connect to their own issues. For example, like I work with plantation workers. They might not interested in like hate speech against Rohingya, but how each their struggle, they all are marginalized. And that how we bring the conversation, like how marginalized should help another marginalized, or those community that has been discriminated. So the conversation starts there. And they also do a lot of capacity building training, like very simple language being used and how to make them understand the values, and also how to understand the discrimination. So I think it's all start with dialogues and conversation, because with community, we can't talk about international languages or standards, but it's more like how they can see each issues related to them and their struggle, for example. So that's one of the way that we approaching our work in Malaysia. So with capacity building training to teach them, and also to learn from them. Like they have a lot of recommendation what Article 19 can do in Malaysia, for example. So it's both way, it works both way with the community. So that's one of my suggestions.
Can I just add something here, Teddy?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, well, I mean, with respect to religious freedom in Indonesia, if you talk to the higher echelons in the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Indonesia, they would not say that there is any problem with religious freedom in Indonesia. To them, religious freedom is a closed case, you know, with Articles 28 and 29 in our Constitution. So their preference is obviously for what they term as religious harmony. And so, you know, we did research in 2018 and 19 about the dialectics of religious freedom and harmony. And obviously what we found was that there is this, you know, preference on the part of the government and security apparatus and the sort of majority and mainstream religious groups to opt for religious harmony as opposed to religious freedom. And obviously this has created problems because oftentimes religious harmony, again, like the case of COVID, sweeps the problems of religious freedom you know, under the carpet and makes everything seem like fine, you know. And this has been what, you know, in response, what we have done was develop this work together with the Ministry of Religious Affairs on religious literacy, which targeted religious extension officers, which amount to 115,000 across the archipelago. And we trained around 1,000 religious extension officers and the officers of the ministry on essentially religious diversity, religion and ecology, and including religion and the internet, whereby we focus and emphasize on the need to avoid religious hate speeches. And some of these religious extension officers have actually done similar programs in their own districts, in their own towns and circles on these topics. And so I thought that could be also used as an example of some of the things that we are doing in terms of trying to mitigate the problem of hate speech in Indonesia.
Thank you, Diki and Nalini, for sharing voices from the ground. Are there other questions from the participants? Yes, Liv. Okay, you're recognized.
Thank you, Teddy. Yes, my name is Liv Kvanvik, and I'm the director of IPP FoRB, also a co-organizer of this webinar together with APHR and the Stephanos Alliance. Just want to say thank you to all the presenters for really, really interesting introductions and good questions during this session. My question could be to all of you, but I think mainly to Joseph and Nalini. Just want to go back to the international framework with regards to combating hate speech. I think from your summary, Nalini, I think it's and also from Article 18 and 19's toolkit, it's very clear that the threshold for introducing laws that actually prohibit and also may lead to punishments with regards to hate speech is high, and that there is a reason for this, because on the other hand, we have the protection of freedom of expression. And that a key word here is also incitement. So expressing something which someone may feel hurt about or even see as discriminatory is not necessarily an action that requires a law that leads to legal punishment. So I was wondering if the two of you could reflect a little bit more about the potential dangers inherent in introducing legislation combating hate speech, and how this may also pose or present a tool to governments to stifle legitimate dissenting voices, the media, the political opposition, etc. And I think one issue here is when definitions become too broad, they are open to interpretation and may then be used in also in circumstances where the government may see this as a very useful instrument in actually silencing voices that are very uncomfortable to have around. So thank you very much.
Joseph, on the line, can you respond to Liv's questions?
Nalini, do you want to go
Okay,
first?
have Joseph first and then maybe Nalini.
Joe, you can go first.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Liv, and I think this is something that human rights groups have struggled for quite a long time with, of finding that balance between expression and restricting speech that could incite violence and so forth. And I think that the danger sometimes in allowing governments such tools is that we've seen how it can have an overreach and have vague provisions that allow them to go much further. I think it's about finding that balance and ensuring that there are experts involved in the conversation. It's not just the lawmakers alone, but bringing ensuring it's a multi-stakeholder process, and that the law itself is only just one out of a multiple forms of intervention that can be taken. I want to go back to the point I think Nalini made also, is the idea of having counter narratives. I think we need to start off with non-legal approaches to hate speech first as a start before reaching that point of legislating on it and prosecuting on it, because I think there are many other approaches that civil society has learned to address these issues. And obviously, does it meet the threshold of where violence has been committed? So I think for me, we need to discuss these laws and explore them at the national level, but taking into account that there are multiple factors and multiple stakeholders who should be involved in that process, as well as ensuring non-legal approaches. That would be my response to that, Liv.
Yeah, I thanks for the questions. I agree with Joe entirely on that, and I think it's the concern of hate speech is real, and I think the state has obligations and to counter the hate speech and protect the minorities. But also, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think there's a high threshold that we must there's a highest threshold, and the state must meet the highest threshold when they want to counter hate speech or any speeches that cause harm. And I think in particular in Rabat plan of actions emphasize when they're unpacking the Article 22 of ICCPR provision on incitement, it must be exceptional measure of last resort. So when we talk about countering hate, like when state want to counter hate, that should be the last resort. As Joe mentioned, we have other multiple approaches like civil actions or administrative actions. So the state should consider the actions based on the speeches and based on the harm that has been caused. If it's like in the Myanmar situation, for example, it's a genocide. It's very clearly, but the state initiated the genocide. But in other circumstances, if there is a speech has caused harm, the state has to see that the measure should measure according to the speech and the harm. So if something like, for example, in Malaysian context, it's been used against so many things. For example, when people criticize a government leader, for example, or criticize certain policies, for example, that speech should be protected, even should be promoted, that people should criticize. But there are speeches that we should ask the government to interfere. For example, the one that happened against the Rohingya refugees, that should be as restricted, but then government didn't do anything. So the highest threshold should be the last resort, and you need to have lots of measures to be taken into consideration. And most importantly, it has this three-part test, legitimate aim, it has to be necessary and proportionate, and it must follow what has been stated under Article 22 and 9 of the ICCPR. And I think that's most important. I think, and also if you see in the Rabat Plan of Action, they also have categorized the 6 steps of identifying hate speech, for example, the threshold. So you can see the context, the speaker, the intent of the speaker, the expansion of the expression, and so you have to see this before you actually define or you consider what is hate speech. So we have steps to follow. And if government is genuine and want to counter hate speech, I think they will follow these steps that has been listed out in UN Resolution 1618 and also Rabat Plan of Action. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Nalini. Really very helpful suggestions. Robin,
May I
you'd
just
like to
add a
answer
quick point?
the same question. Yeah.
Yes, just quickly on the point of definitions and thresholds. I just wanted to mention that in our conference recently on hate speech over 3 days, one of the points that came up was that emerge is hate speech is contextual. And so what qualifies as hate speech here, maybe in Thailand as opposed to Malaysia or the US or wherever, it differs. And so researchers from local universities here in Bangkok, Thammasat University, pointed out that, for example, and this refers to the third type of hate speech that we noted in our report, hate speech related to political ideologies. So some of the researchers here presented on younger versus older generation and the kinds of hate speech that is going on here in Thailand. I cannot recall the word specifically, and they themselves were reluctant to even say those words because they felt embarrassed. And so I would just note that dimension of the possible contextual meaning of hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. It's really learned something from your sharings. I'm where we'll be compiling all of those inputs, and we hope to be able to share them to parliamentarians. Because that's what we really need, concrete suggestions. I see Andrew Koo has raised his hand also. Maybe you can address your question to specific panelists. Andrew, you're recognized.
Thank you. Andrew Koo from Malaysia. My question has to do with defamation of religion. We may have talked about hate speech, but we haven't really used the term defamation of religion. And I know in terms of international standards, that's not something that people really want to acknowledge or really talk about. But I think from an Asian and Southeast Asian context, this is something that we grapple with every day. And so, the issue really is, what constitutes an insult? What constitutes an offensive speech, and whether or not I am entitled as an individual to take umbrage at a general comment or a general criticism against the religion that I profess, and whether I therefore have the right and the responsibility to stand up and to defend my religion against insults. And I think that the issue is also made worse in cases where you do have a state religion and the population has a dominant majority that belongs to that state religion. And so all the lawmaking powers are, weighted in favor of the majority to make rules and to draft laws in a way that limits the acceptability of comments and criticisms against or about the majority religion, but then is totally indifferent to comments that are made by on other religions. So there's a lack of symmetry in terms of the application of hate laws. So I'm just wondering, generally to all the speakers, whether you would comment on what what can be done or what ought to be done in situations like that to bring about a more even application and understanding of what constitutes hate speech. Thank you.
Yes, Dicky?
Right. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that excellent question. In fact, the Indonesians, together with our partners in FoRB and friends in Europe and in other places, that we had just recently done an online conference with 4 sessions on blasphemy and basically defamation of religion. And as you probably know, in Indonesia, we still have the law number 1 PNPS 1965, which is really a draconian law on quote and unquote the misuse of religion and defamation of religion. And our efforts, our recent efforts have been to really look into the laws and the derivative laws that are embedded in the criminal code, most notably in 156A in our criminal code. And we have actually done some legal analysis and done some legal drafting in terms of what to table to the parliamentarians in terms of the changing of the both spirit and also letter of the law pertaining to this. Because as you correctly mentioned, I think it's very hard to get a consensus from society as to what really constitutes defamation of religion or blasphemy. I mean, people having a different viewpoint or interpretation of religion, in our case, in Indonesia, could constitute blasphemy of law or defamation of religion. And as some of you probably have, recall in the recent 2016 gubernatorial elections in Jakarta, Governor Ahok was charged through this blasphemy law. We need to do some serious lobbying and educating the public and also some of the people who are in government with respect to how we could change this law to the extent that it will be more consistent with our principles of democracy and religious freedom embedded in Articles 28 and 29.
Okay, thank you, DK. Do we have other questions?
May I just make a quick comment on that last question?
Sure, please do, Robin.
Thank you. Andrew, thank you for the question and good to see you. I have a wider or broader thought, maybe related to your point, but I would just like to mention the need for, or let's say the disappearance of critical thinking in particular religions themselves, all religions. And one of the interesting things over the last few decades is the rise of intolerant forms of particular religions. And I think that dimension needs to be addressed as well. Every religion has a critical, religious faith has a particular critical strand to it. And why is it that the critical strand has disappeared in some cases? So I think that is a discussion that also has to be had in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I know Edmund Bond had a question which he posted in the chat box. Unfortunately, it's deleted. I can't read all of it. So would you like to ask your question directly, Edmund?
Kong Teddy, could you check your WhatsApp, please? I just missed there.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so I'll read Edmund's question to any of the panelists. What is new that we are bringing? Sorry. what is new that we are bringing in human rights on dealing with hate speech? We have been hearing the same dimensions, discourses from human rights, and it is good to being kept reminded on the principles, laws, practices, but surely human rights has much more than that to offer. What is this that we are missing? Is the question clear? Okay, would anyone hazard an answer?
Okay, I will just add my 2 cents to that question.
Okay.
Thank you. I think human rights refers obviously to the set of rules, moral standards and rules that we find in international instruments, in international practice and so on. But I think also it's important to remember another way of approaching what are those moral standards and what are the resulting rights and so on. And I think there I refer to, for example, Amartya Sen's idea of dialogue and conversation from the bottom up. And I think human rights starts there. It starts with those kind of everyday conversations until you find, you know, in an atmosphere of respect, until you find the equilibrium that every society should have and deserves. So I'll leave it there.
I just want to add to the question because I think like we were calling for like multi-stakeholder approach on countering hate speech. I think we also need multidisciplinary approaches. For example, Edmund and ourselves, Article 19 is doing a research in Malaysia, finding root causes by using social science as the foundation. So I think during our initial findings, there are a lot of things that Edmund and the team have discovered from the research. And I think one of the way that Edmund, I think, you know, you can extend it further, but one of the way that we're trying to counter hate speech is also not through only the legal perspective, but also like social sciences and other disciplinary discipline, because I think it's as much as it's responsible for everyone, is also everyone should come together and have this, you know, recommendations or way of work other than just legally. Like Robin said, legal perspective has put a standards, and now it's just more like an implementation. And in the implementation can be in any way, any forms, and not necessarily human rights forms. It can be any ways. You know, conversation can happen without having a human rights kind of conversation, but it's just a conversation between two or one group of people. So I think it's like a multi approach, and we also have to discover this together, because I think this is one of the way that we are discovering today. I think this in the panel today. So I think it's something that we need to discover, and I'm very looking forward for Edmund's research. Once we have the findings, we can launch the report, and maybe people from the region could benefit from this. So I'm looking forward for the research, actually. Thanks.
Thank you, Nalini. I guess that would be a good way to wrap up our Q&A session, unless there is a burning question. Oh, I see the Dicky. Would you also like to add your 2 cents?
Yeah, I'm just gonna take a stab at Edmund's question and perhaps be a little bit more controversial here, because I've been involved in the write-up and in the signing of the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere. And so for my friends and I, you know, we see human dignity as also a very good entry point when you're dealing with human rights, you know, when you're talking about human rights to traditional communities and religious people. I think religious people are much more accepting toward the idea and application of human dignity than human rights, because to them, human rights, you know, is much more geared toward the individual rights, while they are probably, you know, born and bred and embedded in a culture that is much more, you know, communitarian or community-based rights. And so the idea is to essentially emphasize that, you know, every person has worth and value, and has the same worth and value as any person, regardless of religion, creed, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. But I understand the complexity of this and some of the resistance, probably from some of our European friends as well, with respect to the human dignity, because it takes away the obligation of the state to maintain and to guarantee human rights. And I think this is where we need to sort of try to bridge the discourses and application of human rights and human dignity. Because if you look into your constitution, if you look at the human rights, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the ICCPR, each one of these talk about human dignity as well, usually in their first article, right? And so human dignity is there, but it seems to have been lost in translation as we are talking about laws and legislations and policies of the state and so on. So I'm just putting that up not as a solution to the problem that Edmund is bringing, but just a possible entry point to understanding a wider and more possible discourses that we could conceive of. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess that's just about all the time that we have. It's already 5 p.m. So unless there are other burning questions or maybe any closing remarks from the resource persons, maybe I'll just give you your last takeaways from our seminar. Maybe we can start with Joseph.
Sure, yes. No, yeah, I think that we have to tackle this issue at multiple levels. I think you as parliamentarians, policymakers have to really think through some of the issues at that level. But I think civil society has to be a very key part of that process. And in many ways, in the pandemic, we've seen civil society step up where governments, where others have failed in many ways to support communities, to engage with them, particularly the most vulnerable. So I think that's very critical moving forward. But also, I think what Robin mentioned, technology companies, I think we need to understand how they work, what their policies are, how they impact on issues around hate speech. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to ensure that they come on board and address this issue in a serious manner. So I think those are some of my reflections to end this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. May I also request Dr. Robin to share with us your takeaways, final reflections?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity once again. And I would like to echo Joseph's points and many of the points made by fellow panelists. And maybe my concluding thought would be this, to what Dickie was just saying. I understand that the aspect, the point about dignity, maybe that has gotten lost. But I would just point out also that the entire human rights project since 1948 has been grounded in this notion of dignity. And so, number one. And number two, that notion of dignity is not simply a Western notion. If you look at who drafted the Universal Declaration, Asians from the continent of Asia, from Lebanon, from China, from India, and elsewhere. More than 10 constitutions from Asia at the time were compiled by the United Nations and then became the basis of the draft. Concept of human dignity, I think, is central. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And Dickie, any last words?
Not really, but I just like to say that I think we need to remind our governments to not use this COVID-19 pandemic to sort of exploit the loopholes, both political and legal loopholes, and to pass any legislations that may infringe the human rights and freedom of religion in any of our countries.
Thank you, Dickie. And finally, Nalini.
Thank you for the opportunity. I just want to end with this. I think countering hate speech is the whole society's approach, and we all are responsible in countering hate speech. And most importantly, we all are responsible to promote tolerance and pluralism and diversity. While we all are human rights defender, we also shouldn't be the center of every conversation concerning the hate speech or FoRB. I think because the minorities are the most affected. The rest of the stakeholders must keep protection and dialogue with the affected community. I think that's how I want to end it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I've been moderating this webinar, but I'm also a very eager participant and an eager learner from the inputs that you've shared today. So in behalf of APHR, IPP FoRB, and Stephanos Alliance, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists, Joseph, Robin, Dicky, and Nalini, as well as our participants, those who asked questions, those who stayed with us for the past 2 hours. Thank you very much, and I do hope that we work towards really pushing anti-hate speech legislation as well as very relevant legislations in our own respective parliaments in defending human rights in our Southeast Asian region. So thank you very much. Have a good day to everyone.